My name is Vera Kimura. I'm 37. 3 months ago, I found a spreadsheet on my late father's laptop. Not hidden, not encrypted. Sitting in a folder labeled Family, alongside his tax returns and his insurance documents and his annual budget files, the same careful organizational system he had maintained for 40 years of managing his household with the specific methodical attention of a man who believed that accurate records were a form of respect for the things you cared about. The spreadsheet was titled Family Loan Ledger, and it contained, in my father's precise formatting, a complete record of every loan he had made to every member of our family across 22 years, with dates and amounts and interest calculations and a running balance for each borrower showing how much had been repaid and how much remained outstanding. My name was in the spreadsheet. My brother Marcus's name was in the spreadsheet. 3 cousins, 2 aunts. My mother, who surprised me, and whom I will explain. The total outstanding balance across all borrowers as of the spreadsheet's last update date, which was 6 weeks before my father died, was $418,000. Of that total, the amount outstanding against my name was $11,000. The amount outstanding against Marcus's name was $263,000. Marcus had been making payments. The payment history column showed this. He had repaid, across 14 years, approximately $47,000 against an original principal of $310,000. He had $263,000 remaining at a carefully calculated interest rate my father had applied consistently and that the spreadsheet tracked to the penny. Before I tell you what happened when I showed Marcus the spreadsheet, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if this story is landing somewhere real. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now, let me take you back to where this started. I need to tell you about my father, Raymond Kimura, before I tell you about the spreadsheet, because the spreadsheet is Raymond, distilled into a document, and you cannot fully understand what the document means without understanding the man who kept it. My father was a second-generation Japanese American, born in Sacramento in 1951. The son of parents who had spent the Second World War in an internment camp, and who had emerged from that experience with the specific set of values that extreme adversity sometimes produces in people who survive it with their integrity intact. Not bitterness, though they had every reason for bitterness. Not resignation. A kind of compressed, deliberate determination to build something solid and to maintain it carefully and to document it accurately. Because they had learned from specific personal experience that the world could take things from you without warning, and that the best defense against that taking was to know precisely what you had and to have it properly recorded. Raymond absorbed these values completely. He worked for 38 years as an accountant at a regional manufacturing firm in the Sacramento area, a career that suited his specific temperament precisely. The combination of numerical precision and systematic organization that accounting requires at its best. He retired at 65 with the kind of financial stability that 38 years of careful saving and modest living, and consistent investment produce, not wealth in the way the word is commonly used, but the specific kind of security that comes from never spending more than you have, and always knowing exactly what you have, and always making decisions with complete and current information. He married my mother, Helen, in 1978. My mother is 68 years old and is, in most respects, the opposite temperament from my father, warm and intuitive and comfortable with ambiguity in ways that Raymond was not, a combination that somehow produced, across 44 years of marriage, one of the more genuinely functional partnerships I have observed in a family. My mother managed the household's emotional life and its social calendar and its relationships with the extended family. My father managed the household's financial life and its administrative systems. These two domains overlapped considerably in practice, but maintained enough separation that each of them operated with genuine authority in its respective areas, which I think was the structural reason the partnership worked as well as it did. Marcus is 3 years older than me. He is 40 now, and I want to describe him accurately rather than either generously or harshly, because the story I am telling is not a story about a bad person, but about a complicated one, And the complication matters to understanding both the spreadsheet and what I decided to do about it. Marcus is charismatic in the way that oldest children in certain families can be charismatic, with the specific social fluency that comes from years of being the center of a family's hopeful attention and of learning, early, how to be what that attention expects. He is funny and warm and genuinely likable, and he has spent most of his adult life generating more goodwill than he has been able to sustain across the full arc of his commitments, which is a pattern I recognized in him by the time I was in my mid-20s, and which I believe Marcus himself recognized, though he never named it directly to me, and I never named it directly to him. Marcus started a restaurant at 31. This was not a surprising decision to anyone who knew him, because Marcus had spent his 20s working in the hospitality industry with a genuine passion for food and service that I believe was entirely authentic. And the restaurant idea was a logical next step from the perspective of his actual interests and abilities. What was perhaps more surprising, in retrospect, was the scale of the initial investment the restaurant required. The location Marcus had chosen in a neighborhood that was on the edge of gentrification but had not yet done so completely, and the specific ambition of the concept, which was more expensive to execute than the initial pro forma my father had reviewed suggested it would be. My father funded the restaurant. I want to be specific about the terms as I understand them from the spreadsheet, because the terms are the story. He provided Marcus with an initial loan of $120,000 at an interest rate of 3%, documented in the spreadsheet with the notation initial restaurant capitalization, January, 14 years ago. The interest rate was below market but not zero, which I think tells you something specific about my father's philosophy of helping, which was not to give money away without accountability, but to make the money available at genuinely supportive terms without being terms that removed all responsibility from the borrower. The restaurant opened. It struggled, as restaurants do, in the first 18 months. And during that period, my father made 2 additional loans, $60,000 and $45,000 respectively, both documented in the spreadsheet with notations about the specific operational need each loan addressed: working capital shortfall and equipment replacement. The restaurant stabilized and, eventually, for approximately 3 years, performed adequately. Not exceptionally, not in the way Marcus had originally hoped, but adequately, covering its operating costs and servicing a portion of the debt it owed my father while providing Marcus with a modest income. Then the restaurant had a series of bad years. Not catastrophic, not the dramatic collapse that produces news stories, but the kind of slow accumulation of difficulty that small food service businesses encounter when the neighborhood economics shift slightly against them, and the competition increases, and the specific combination of factors that made the original location viable stops being the combination that produces reliable traffic. Marcus borrowed more, twice, to cover specific crises, loans of $25,000 and $35,000, respectively, both in the spreadsheet, both documented with the same precision as the initial loans, both at the same 3% interest rate. The restaurant closed 8 years ago. My father made one final loan after the closure, $15,000, which the spreadsheet notation described as personal stabilization, the category of loan that exists when a business has failed, and the person who ran it needs time and resources to reorganize their life before whatever comes next. Marcus used this money to cover the period between the restaurant's closure and his eventual return to employment, which took approximately 8 months and which produced, at the end of that period, a job in corporate catering management that has been his primary employment for the past 8 years, and that has provided him with a stable, if not expansive, income. Marcus had been making payments against the accumulated debt throughout these 8 years. The payment history column showed this clearly. Monthly payments that ranged from $500 to $1,200, depending, apparently, on his financial situation in any given period, because the amounts varied in a pattern that suggested they were calibrated to what was manageable, rather than to a fixed schedule. My father had been accepting these payments and recording them accurately and crediting them against the principal and the accrued interest according to the spreadsheet's calculations, with the specific unhurried patience of a man who had made a decision to support his son and had not regretted the decision, even as the repayment extended across years rather than the shorter period the original loan terms had perhaps implied. $47,000 repaid across 8 years against a total debt of $310,000 plus accumulated interest. $263,000 still outstanding when my father died. 6 weeks after the spreadsheet's last update of a heart failure that was sudden and final, and that left both Marcus and me without the conversation about the spreadsheet that my father had apparently been preparing to have, based on evidence I will tell you about shortly, but had not yet had. My name was in the spreadsheet for $11,000, which represented 2 loans my father had made to me, one of $8,000 14 years ago, when Marcus and I were both in our early to mid-20s, and I needed a specific sum to cover a gap between the sale of my first apartment and the closing on my second one, a bridge loan that my father had made at the same 3% interest rate and that I had repaid in full within the year, and one of $3,000 7 years ago when I had a specific medical expense that my insurance did not cover and that I had repaid within 8 months. The outstanding balance of $11,000 in my column was entirely accrued interest on the $3,000 loan that had taken longer than expected to repay due to some additional medical expenses in the same period. Interest that I had not been tracking, because my father had not charged me interest directly, but had apparently been tracking it in the spreadsheet for his own records. I want to be honest about something here, which is that finding my name in the spreadsheet for $11,000, the majority of which was interest I had not known was being tracked, was its own specific kind of surprise that I needed to process separately from the much larger surprise of Marcus's column. I had believed my loans were fully repaid. They were not, in my father's accounting, fully repaid. That was a small discovery relative to what Marcus's column contained, but it was real, and I needed to acknowledge it before I could approach the larger situation with the clear-headedness it required. I found the spreadsheet on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after my father's funeral. I had been going through his files as part of the estate administration process, which my mother had asked me to help with specifically because, of the 2 of us, I am the one more comfortable with financial documentation, a trait I apparently inherited from Raymond more directly than Marcus did. I had expected to find the tax returns, the insurance documents, and the investment account statements. I had not expected to find this. I sat with the spreadsheet for a long time before doing anything else. I went through it column by column and row by row, the way my father would have wanted any financial document examined, completely and systematically, before drawing any conclusions. I verified the calculations. They were accurate to the penny, which was not surprising. I read every notation, which took a long time because my father had notated every entry with the specific care of someone who understood that documentation should be self-explanatory, rather than requiring the keeper of the records to be present to interpret them. By the time I had read everything, I had a complete picture of 22 years of family lending, tracked with the same precision my father had applied to everything else he had ever managed. I found something else in the same folder as the spreadsheet, a document titled Draft, which was a Word file that appeared to be a letter my father had been in the process of writing, addressed to Marcus and me both, that he had apparently not finished before he died. The draft was 3 pages long and was dated approximately 2 months before his death. It read, in the portions that appeared complete enough to convey his intention, as the introduction to a conversation he had been planning to have with both of us about the spreadsheet and what he wanted to happen with the outstanding balances after his death. He had written, I want both of you to know that every loan I have ever made to either of you was made freely and without resentment, from a position of genuine love and genuine belief in what you were trying to build. I have never regretted a single dollar. I want that to be the first thing you understand when you read the rest of this. He had written, I have kept these records not because I plan to demand repayment at any specific time, but because I believe that accurate records are a form of respect for the relationship they document. A loan that is not recorded becomes a gift that neither party fully understands, and I preferred clarity to ambiguity even when the subject matter was personal rather than professional. He had written, "I have been thinking for some time about what I want to happen with Marcus's outstanding balance after I am gone, and I have not yet reached a conclusion I am satisfied with, which is why I have not yet had this conversation with either of you directly. What I know is that I do not want the existence of this debt to damage the relationship between Marcus and Vera after I am not here to provide context for it. The debt is real and accurately recorded, and Marcus has been faithful in his repayments in a way I want acknowledged. What the appropriate resolution of the remaining balance is, I am not yet certain, and I want to think carefully before I decide." The draft ended there. 3 pages of careful thinking about a conversation he had been preparing to have, which his death had made it impossible to finish. I called my mother before I called Marcus. I want to tell you about that call because it matters to understanding the full picture the spreadsheet contained and to explaining why my mother's name was in it, which I had promised myself I would explain. My mother's entry in the spreadsheet was a loan of $22,000 made 8 years ago with a notation for personal household expense, and it had been repaid in full. The payment history column showed, within 3 years, the last repayment made 5 years ago. I had not known this loan existed. I called my mother and told her I had found the spreadsheet and asked her about her entry. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that was the year Marcus's restaurant closed, and we needed to cover some of the family's expenses while Marcus was between jobs. Your father loaned the money to me directly so that Marcus would not know where it was coming from, I said. Why didn't you want Marcus to know? She said, because your father felt that Marcus was already dealing with considerable shame about the restaurant, and he did not want to add to that by making the help feel like another loan on top of everything else Marcus already owed. So he loaned the money to me, and I used it for the household expenses, and Marcus lived with us during that period and had meals and a place to stay and never knew that the family's ability to absorb his presence during that 8 months was partially funded by a loan your father made specifically so Marcus would not have to feel the weight of it. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think it is the piece of the story that changed the most in my understanding of my father when I read it. Not the large numbers, not the $310,000 in the primary column, but the $22,000 loan made to my mother so that my brother would not have to feel ashamed of the help he was receiving. That is the specific shape of my father's love. The love that finds a way to provide what is needed while carefully managing the dignity of the person who needs it. That is what Raymond Kimura's spreadsheet actually contains beneath the numbers. I called Marcus on a Thursday evening. I had spent 2 days thinking about how to have this conversation, and I had concluded, after considerable internal debate, that the right approach was the most direct one, the one my father would have used. Not because directness is always the easiest approach, but because it is usually the most respectful one. And Marcus deserved to be respected even in the context of a conversation that was going to be difficult for him. He picked up, and we talked for a few minutes about our mother, about how she was managing, about the logistics of the estate. Then I said, Marcus, I need to talk to you about something I found in Dad's files. Can you give me your full attention for a few minutes? He said, Of course. I said, I found a spreadsheet. Dad kept a complete record of every loan he made to family members across 22 years. I've read through all of it carefully. He was quiet. I said, You're in it. He said, I know. I said, the outstanding balance in your column is $263,000. He said, I know. I said, You knew the spreadsheet existed? He said, I knew Dad was tracking the loans. He showed me the spreadsheet 7 years ago. He showed it to me after the restaurant closed, when he was making the personal stabilization loan. He said he wanted me to understand what the full picture looked like. I said, You've known for 7 years. He said, Yes. I said, Why didn't you tell me? He said, Because it was between Dad and me, and because I was ashamed, and because every time I thought about telling you, the shame was bigger than my willingness to have the conversation. I asked him if he knew about the draft letter, the conversation Dad had been preparing to have with both of us. He said no. I told him what it contained. I read him the relevant sections. When I finished, Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he said he was trying to figure out how to protect me from this conversation, even while preparing to have it. I said, yes. That's what the loan to Mom was about, too. He said, what loan to Mom? I explained. Marcus was quiet again, longer this time. When he spoke, his voice had changed in a way I want to try to describe accurately. It was the specific voice of someone who has just understood something about a person they loved and can no longer ask questions of. The voice of arriving at a complete picture too late to say anything directly to the person in it. He said he was always trying to protect my dignity. Even the way he kept the records. It was never about making me feel bad. It was about him needing to know the truth precisely. About everything, always. I said, yes. That's who he was. I want to tell you what happened with the outstanding balance, because I think the resolution matters, and because I think how Marcus and I arrived at it together, without our father there to guide the conversation he had been preparing for, says something about what his careful preparation actually produced, even though he did not live to complete it. Marcus and I met in person 2 weeks after our phone call. We met at my mother's house, at the kitchen table where the three of us had eaten 10,000 meals together, with the spreadsheet printed and between us and coffee going cold, and my mother present because she said she wanted to be there, and we both said yes without needing to discuss it. Marcus put a document on the table. He had prepared it with an attorney, which surprised me. It was a formal repayment proposal, structured as a modification of the existing loan terms, in which Marcus proposed the following. He would continue making monthly payments of $1,200, which was the highest amount his current income allowed him to sustain consistently against the outstanding principal. The interest would be frozen at the current accrued amount rather than continuing to compound, because continuing to compound interest on a loan that would now never be personally received by the lender served no one's interest. And at a specific milestone, when the total repaid reached $150,000 against the original principal of $310,000, meaning when Marcus had paid back approximately half of what he originally borrowed, the remaining balance would be formally forgiven, to be treated as the gift my father had always intended the loans to represent, even while documenting them as loans. I looked at the document for a long time. Then I said, Marcus, where did you get the number? He said, it's the number I can actually repay in my lifetime, at the rate I can sustain, with a realistic projection of my income and expenses across the next 15 years. I said, Dad would have said the number should be what's fair, not just what's possible. He said, I know. I've been thinking about that. I think what's fair and what's possible are the same number in this situation, because the alternative to a realistic repayment plan is a debt that sits on our relationship for the rest of our lives without ever being addressed, which is not something Dad would have wanted either. He paused. He said the draft letter said he didn't want the debt to damage our relationship after he was gone. I think this is the plan that honors that. I said, I think you're right. My mother reached across the table and put her hand over Marcus's. She said, your father would be satisfied with this. Not because the number is the number he would have chosen himself, but because you have taken it seriously enough to have it documented properly, thought through carefully, and put it on the table honestly. That is what he would have wanted. The honesty of it, not the specific number. I signed the modification agreement. Marcus and I both did. My mother witnessed it. We had it notarized the following week. I want to tell you something about the $11,000 in my column. I had been planning to simply pay it after everything because it was real and documented, and I believe that accurate records deserve accurate responses, even when the keeper of the records is no longer alive to receive the payment. My mother, when I told her this, looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, your father noted in the spreadsheet, in a column I had not noticed at first, that certain balances were designated as gifts. She showed me the column. Next to my $11,000, in my father's handwriting in the notes field, were 3 words, already a gift. He had decided, at some point before he died, that whatever remained of my balance was not a debt I owed, but a gift he had chosen to designate, the same language he had used for my mother's entry. And the distinction he had drawn in the draft letter between debts and gifts was alive in that small notation in the same way it was alive in everything else he had left behind. I want to talk to you directly now, wherever you are, whatever time it is. My father kept a spreadsheet for 22 years because he believed that accurate records were a form of respect for the things you cared about. He applied this belief to the family loans the same way he had applied it to his tax returns and his insurance documents and his household budget, not as a mechanism for holding people accountable in a punitive sense, but as a way of honoring the actual reality of what had passed between him and the people he loved. The spreadsheet was not a weapon. It was not a ledger of grievances. It was, in its specific careful completeness, an act of love. The kind of love that takes things seriously enough to document them accurately, that respects the people it loves enough to maintain an honest record of what they have shared. If you are lending money to family members, document it. Not because you plan to demand repayment or because you distrust the people you are helping, but because the documentation is a form of clarity that protects everyone involved, including the person who is receiving the help, from the specific ambiguity that exists when significant money moves between people who love each other without anyone knowing precisely what the terms of that movement are. My father was preparing to have a conversation with Marcus and me about the spreadsheet. He did not live to have it. What he left instead was enough: the draft of the conversation, the spreadsheet itself, and the specific organizational system that put both of them exactly where I would find them when I needed to find them. He could not finish the conversation. He made sure the evidence required was complete. That is the most Raymond Kimura thing I can imagine. And in the months since finding that folder in his files, it has made me love him more precisely than I did before, which is the specific gift that understanding someone more completely after they are gone sometimes produces. Marcus is making his monthly payments. I talk to him more than I did before. The spreadsheet is in my own files now, maintained in my father's organizational system, because it is a document that deserves to be preserved accurately. The record of a man who believed that what you document is what you actually care about, and who cared across 22 years of careful entries about his family. That is today's story on the Family Ledger. Leave a comment wherever you are watching from. Tell me what time it is, and whether there is someone in your life who has been quietly keeping a record of what they gave you that you have not yet seen or acknowledged. I read every single one. Subscribe to the next story every week. Check the description for another one I think you will connect with. Thank you for being here.